the opportunity. It has been a good 2 years since the Navneet Singh Johar judgment was delivered. Um, while while it was an important moment and an important moment to and a baby step, many of us in the community, while I can't speak on behalf of everybody, many of us in the larger LGBTIQ plus communities take to it as a baby step, the very first baby step, because it was just about decriminalization, um, um, while it used quite a lot of useful tools within, tools such as the doctrine of non-retrogression and the doctrine of progressive realization of rights. Now, as I hand it over to the rest of the speakers, I'd like to make just about one or two points and then pass it on to the panel. We have a very illustrious panel that was introduced today. Um, uh, the Indian subcontinent and the SAARC nations, many of whom are represented here on the panel today, the struggles of the LGBTIQ plus communities are very different in each of these countries. And even within a certain geography, the struggles and the lived realities of each of the sub-communities and subaltern communities within communities, and I don't quite like to use the word community as it gets a very Unitarian monolith sense, and there isn't any one such monolith Unitarian community, and hence communities. The struggles of each of these communities within a certain geography are also very diverse and different, cutting across various forms of social exclusions such as caste, class, disability, HIV status, age, religion, and so on, and the list goes on. So without much further ado, now I would urge our friend and co-panelist, um, Arita. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the first name correctly, and my apologies if I mispronounced it. Arita from Sri Lanka, one of our illustrious panelists, to take us through the kind of journey and struggles of our friends in Sri Lanka and throw light on that. Over to you, Arita.
Thank you so much, Vijayanti. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
And it's Arita, and you were perfect in the pronunciation. Thank you very much for having me and for having Pro Bono as part of this panel. It is a great privilege for us to be part of this conversation and to share Sri Lanka's journey of decriminalization, which, unlike our peers in India and Nepal, that we are to realize as a dream. Sri Lanka, of course, we share many cultural and historic similarities with our friends in the subcontinent. Not only do we share religious and more ancient linkages, but we also share a common colonial history, having been part of the British Empire. And like many of us, especially if you look at India, Sri Lanka also has a very similar legislation as part of our penal code, which is Section 365, that prohibits carnal intercourse against the order of nature. And also we have Section 365A, which prohibits indecency between persons. Now, these are the primary two pieces of legislation which is used practically by law enforcement against members of the LGBT community and primarily against same-sex, primarily against gay and lesbian people, persons for same-sex consensual relations. Now, the history of our law has a bit more complexity than in South Asia, than our other countries in the South Asian region. 365 and 365A did go through a reformation in the mid 90s, around 1995, where they expanded the ambit of the law to also include provisions for the protection of children within the law itself, with increased penalty against an offender for committing an act, an unnatural sexual act against a child. We also had the amendment of the gross indecency offense, which originally was the offense of gross indecency between two men, which then changed to gross indecency between any two persons. Now, very much like our South Asian counterparts, these laws has had very limited application in the wider context of our legal history, and it's almost benign status. I wouldn't call it completely benign because I Pro Bono is actively working to represent people being prosecuted still under these offenses, but it almost benign status has been used as a continuous argument by political representatives against its repeal. Now, an unfortunate disadvantage that we have here in Sri Lanka, which is not shared with the rest of our South Asian counterparts, is that the constitution of Sri Lanka is not supreme in its text. It's parliament which has supremacy. And once parliament has passed any form of legislation, the constitutionality of that law cannot be challenged in court. There is provision to challenge the constitutionality of a law at its bill stage, so before it's passed as an act of parliament. But once it is passed as an act of parliament, you cannot challenge it. Now, of course, these laws were passed primarily about 135 years ago, even before the idea of such judicial review and challenges of laws based on its constitutionality even evolved as part of legal jurisprudence. But unfortunately, this this limitation in our constitution really only allows us to seek a political solution through following the parliamentary process and working with the legislature to reform our law. Certain positive developments in the last few years. So in 2014, our Attorney General made a public statement saying that discrimination against LGBT people was unconstitutional and that these specific offenses should not be used against LGBT people in a discriminatory manner. Now, this statement has been consistently repeated by the Attorney General in 2015. And has are included implicitly and the right law 2016 and 17, we've had well, the admission that
I guess the net is playing up. Aretha, can you hear us?
I can hear
Uh,
you now.
yes, it's. I think it's better now. Please go on.
Yeah.
Please go on.
Where did you stop hearing me?
Your Attorney General kept reiterating year after year, I suppose, and then it got fragmented, heavily fragmented.
Okay. Okay. So you stopped hearing me from there. Okay. So what the Attorney General said was that LGBT people were protected under the general right to equality in the Constitution, and that they were implicitly protected in the prohibition of discrimination provisions, which prohibits discrimination against persons based on sex, based on religion, based on caste, political opinion. And there is that final line of that sentence which says, and other such grounds. So the Attorney General said that LGBT people were included in this section of and other such grounds. Now, unfortunately, even though we've had these progressive statements coming from the Attorney General, this has not translated to the practical lives of LGBT people, and that this message has not gone down to law enforcement, which is still actively arresting and prosecuting, especially gay men. And also, we had last week a case where a lesbian couple were arrested and prosecuted by the police. And what happens is a lot of these prosecutions are happening at magistrate level, so they're not even getting reported, which is why they sort of they get swept under the carpet, and this perception arrives that this is actually a benign legislation which is not being enforced and which is actually quite incorrect. Now, some positive developments we experienced in 2016-17 was the introduction of the gender recognition process in order to enable transgender persons to have their gender identity recognized or changed. And this was actually done through an administrative process as opposed to a legislative process. And the achievement of Sri Lanka is actually a very useful example of how administrative solutions can be found for the struggles of LGBT people, especially where you come across hostile parliaments or legislations. And we did at that time was to have the Ministry of Health issue a circular with a guideline on how a gender recognition certificate can be issued to a transgender person. And this did not require any form of surgical intervention. It only required consultation with a psychiatrist and for the government psychiatrist to confirm that the person's gender identity was different to that of their biological sex at birth. And then once a gender recognition certificate was issued, the Registrar General's Department issued a circular which accepted the gender recognition certificate of the Ministry of Health and to use that certificate to change the identity documents of transgender persons. And this included changes to their identity, to their birth certificate, or the identity cards, and the passport. So that was quite a progressive transformation in Sri Lanka. Then we also had a very interesting judgment in 2016, where there were two persons who were being prosecuted for same-sex, for gay sex offences, basically. But it was interesting because they were caught having sex in a public car park, and one of them, ironically, a police officer. So there was a prosecution which went through from the magistrates court, the high court, to the court of appeal, and finally, on the question of sentencing, there was an appeal to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court gave a very interesting judgment here. I mean, in one way, their hands are tied in terms of declaring a certain law unconstitutional. Also, in another way, the court was not being asked to, the appeal was not on the judgment, but on the question of the sentencing, and that the sentencing was excessive. And what the court said, the court asked a very pertinent question. The court said, look, in 2016, is it really necessary for the law to police what people are doing in private? The court had a problem with the fact that these two individuals were being prosecuted under the unnatural sex offense, as opposed to the public indecency offense, which they should have been prosecuted under. And what the court said was that because these two individuals clearly consented to what they were doing, that this does not warrant a custodial sentence, and let them go. So that was quite interesting because the court in some ways made this law impotent when it comes to consensual relations between same-sex persons. Because the court said, look, if two people are consenting to their sexual relations, then you cannot really punish them. They should not be sent to prison for it. The court sort of ignored the fact that actually these two individuals were caught having sex in a public car park. And technically, you could argue the court has set precedents that now two gay men could have sex in public and still get away with it. But I think more importantly, the court was trying to send a message, especially to the police, saying you cannot and you need to stop prosecuting people, especially under these provisions, because we have now decided that they are not prison for them. Now, despite that judgment in 2016, in both 2018 and 19 and this year, lawyers working with iPro Bono have been working to defend especially gay men and one trans man in active prosecutions being led by the police against them for consensual relations. We had a very interesting case last year where the police was prosecuting a trans man who had gone through the gender identity documents, and then he went and married his cis female partner for many years. And there was a complaint from the family of the cis female partner, who was now his wife, and the police went and arrested this trans man, subjected him to humiliating and degrading treatment, to the extent that they got someone to put two fingers inside his sexual parts to determine whether he was a virgin. Again, something which is completely, apart from the fact it was abhorrent, it was, what was the purpose of that test in the first place, and then they began prosecutions against this trans man. We went to court to represent him, and we argued before the court that there was no base for this crime and for this prosecution. And we presented all the documents, and the court accepted the gender recognition certificate. The court accepted the person's new gender identity, and the court also accepted the validity of the marriage, and then dismissed the case. So that was quite groundbreaking in the sense that this is the first time a court in Sri Lanka has accepted the validity of gender recognition certificate, but also the validity of a marriage between a trans person and a cis person. So that's a positive step. Unfortunately, considering that there was a clear violation of the fundamental rights of this person, um, we tried, we were trying to convince the person to appeal for a case of violating fundamental rights, and they did not want to proceed further. And this is a problem we see in almost all cases. Actually, in every single case that we're acting on, is that when there has been such prosecutions and arrest, all these people who are being prosecuted do not want to take up a case to the Supreme Court saying their rights, fundamental rights, have been violated because of the discriminatory application of 365 and 365A against LGBT people. So that's a quick synopsis of where we are. Thank you very much for letting me speak about it. And looking forward to questions and hearing from everyone else.
Thank you ever so much, Rita. That was very insightful and a very concise snapshot of the socio-legal struggles of the LGBTIQ persons and communities in Sri Lanka. This is the first round, and as I hand it over to the next speaker, I just want to share that we'll perhaps allocate 15 to 16 minutes in the first round, and we'll have another short second round so that each speaker gets two opportunities, then followed by questions and answers. Thank you ever so much again, Arita. I now would call upon our friend Rukshana Kapali, to share your journey of struggles for the rights of the LGBTIQ persons, particularly transgender persons from your country, and surely the struggles may be similar at some levels, but very different at many other levels. Over to you.
Jojo Laba, this is how I greet in my native language. I'm Rukshana Kapali, as introduced already. I'm not 20 anymore, I'm 21 now. So first of all, before beginning to talk about the context of Nepal, I feel very tired and very pissed off every time to hear in the international media that Nepal is such a progressive country in terms of LGBTIQ rights. It's such a global beacon in terms of LGBTI rights. And here, I'm very tired to hear this because it completely ignores the lived experiences of transgender people from Nepal, and it's not heard diverse transgender groups, LGBTI groups from Nepal, and just I feel very pissed off due to this reason. I'm going to take through towards the legal context of Nepal and how trans people, how the international portrayal as a very progressive country is not true, and what are our lived experiences living as a trans person in Nepal. So first of all, let's start from this thing that we've never been part of the British Empire, or Nepal was never colonized by the British people. But at the same time, to realize that the Rana regime, which was the autocratic regime in Nepal before democracy was established, it was very close to the British regime. It actually saw the British Empire as a symbol of development and civilization, and wanted to adopt their culture, their architecture, and the way they lived. And it saw the British Empire as a symbolism, as something to be glorified. So the laws in the Muluki Ain that was formed in the Rana regime did have provisions that criminalize homosexuality or quote unquote cross-dressing. So coming towards the point, I think a lot of times when Nepal is seen or portrayed as a very progressive country, you would see the 2007 landmark being coded multiple times, the 2007 landmark being taken as one of the one of the instances that Nepal has progressive laws and legislative measures, but it's actually not completely true. I would say 2007 landmark did had its own positive sides, but there are a lot of different other aspects of the verdict that isn't really discussed, and I think it left a complex legacy on the LGBTIQ community, probably many years after the verdict was made. So rolling into what were some of the harmful, or let's say some of the problematic things that 2007 landmark brought is it established a confusion between sexual orientation and gender identity, because it was constantly using the term sexual orientation and gender identity interchangeably. And it also led, because the vocabulary in the Nepali language, because in the court you can only use Nepali language. So the vocabularies used in Nepali language also also very visibly conflated between gender and sexual orientation. At the same time, it also established a narrative of othering, which means like it was constantly like trans people and other different gender identities were very specifically referred as farak lingi, which means like a different gender. And so that's also how the others gender sort of provision started in Nepal. Another thing is like it's quite debatable. Like the term gender and sexual minorities is in our constitution. There is no legal definition of gender and sexual minorities, but a lot of LGBTIQ people claim their right to using the term. But it's also quite very debated in the LGBTIQ community that are does the term gender and sexual minorities in the Constitution actually respect our rights, or does it address our rights? And also, in 2012, Ministry of Home Affairs published a directive to different institutions providing citizenship certificate on allowing people to tick others as a gender marker. So there was a third option that's male, female, and others, and it definitely came as as something as an impact of the 2007 landmark. But at the same time, the government of Nepal defined others gender as LGBTI. So if you're lesbian, you are a third gender. If you're gay, you're a third gender. If you're bisexual, you're a third gender. If you're transgender, you're a third gender. If you're intersex, you're a third gender, which is very problematic. And so yeah, so we are really contesting this legal provision, and we've been doing our best to sort of repeal this provision that says LGBTI is a third gender. And also the vocabulary, the Nepali vocabulary used for lesbian, gay, bisexual also like ends with the term called lingi, which is more of like gender. That is also the reason why the government stakeholders believe that they are like this is a third gender. Like there are 5 types of third gender, and it's LGBTI. That's what we hear from a lot of government stakeholders here. Also, it's very it's very Hindu centric. Every time we talk about Nepal, like they go on referring to in the Hindu epics, it was in Mahabharata, it was this in this religious book, it was written like this. In Manusmriti, it was written like this. But at the same time, like of course, people who follow Hinduism can completely relate to their religion to justify like their gender identity, or can base their gender identity in their religion. But at the same time, also it's like the drawbacks, like because it's just Hinduism, and that's also coming from a very particular ethnic group, and it does not really grasp the diversity, the religious, the cultural, and the ethnic diversity of Nepal. So it's very exclusionary in its own way, and because it lacks secular values, it also like sort of like justifies a lot of problematic stuff like Manusmriti, which is also the reason why caste system exists. So I think like these are some of the things, that some of the drawbacks that the 2007 landmark has established. Now saying that, there's also this very popular narrative that's across the media. Nepal recognizes transgender people as third gender. I think the media constantly telling that transgender people have been recognized as third gender is very harmful, because it does not acknowledge that all transgender people do not identify as third gender. There are transgender people who identify as male. There are transgender people who identify as female. So I think this whole narrative and this whole establishment completely ignores this population. So now I'll give you a bit of how identity document works in Nepal. So there is a provision that if a child is within 30 days of after a child is born, the child should have a birth certificate. And whatever name and whatever gender is assigned as birth certificate is likely to stay even after your death, which is like also in your death certificate. So basically, you are asked to present your birth certificate in school. Without a birth certificate, you cannot enroll in schools. The school will use the name and gender of your birth certificate, and then you will pass on. And when you will, the age eligibility for citizenship is 16 years. So when you get 16 years, you have to present your birth certificate and your school certificates, and the name and the gender must be congruent in both, and also the form that you fill for a citizenship certificate, which means what is likely in your birth certificate will also pass on to your citizenship certificate. And so after your citizenship certificate is issued, then it's everywhere. Like, it's the key. Even for a SIM card, you need to present your citizenship certificate. And also for like very basic services, citizenship certificate is like everything for someone who lives in Nepal. Saying that a lot of people would have their citizenship by the age of 16. Now, for transgender people, it's not everyone comes out, or not everyone's able to speak about their gender identity at the same age or at the range of the same age. There are different age, like different trans people come out at different time of their life. So talking about, is there a provision to actually change your documents, actually change your name and gender? The answer is no, because if you like go back to the birth certificate, the act that's called National Identity Card and Vital Registration Act 2076, there is a clause that mentions about changing, there's a clause that mentions about changing the details in the birth certificate, but it puts a time frame of 1 year from the issuance of birth certificate, which likely means that you cannot change your birth certificate, which also means you cannot go to your school and ask them to change your educational documents, which also is spoken in the Directive on Operation and Management of Secondary Level Examination 2068. So we use a different calendar. Please don't be scared that we are ahead. So this directive clearly states that you can only change your details in your educational certificate if the details are incongruent to the registration form that you filled. Now, this is very tricky because the registration, you are only allowed to fill those details in the registration form according to your birth certificate. So you can't change your birth certificate means you can't change your educational documents. Now, there is another act called the Citizenship Act 2063, which also has a provision about amending details on citizenship. And the only details you can amend is if you get divorced or if your husband dies, then the woman can change their surnames. And a very trivial spelling mistakes can be corrected, but at the same time, you need to present that the spelling you're demanding is in your other documents, such as like the educational certificate or your birth certificate, which again says like, can transgender people change their gender markers and their names based on all these different laws? No, they cannot. And I'm one of the lived experiences who's faced this. So in 2072, which is 2015, I went to apply for a citizenship certificate where I So I had to present my birth certificate. I had to present my educational documents, which had my gender assigned at birth and my dead name. And when I filled the form as my preferred name, Rukshana Kapali, and gender as female, I was told so I was not allowed to. So I was not allowed to take the application further, and I could access this loophole of others' gender. So if I ticked the others, I could at least be able to change my name. So that's how I got my citizenship certificate. But after I got my citizenship certificate and enrolled for higher studies and got my certificate, so we had this. We don't have it now, but when I was studying in school, so only up to grade 10 it was called school. Grade 11 and grade 12 were called +2, and then it's university. So I could access my education with my preferred name for the +2. But when I wanted to enroll in the university, because my educational certificate from the school and the +2 didn't match, I was denied of education. I'm still denied of education. It's been 3 years. So I can't change my gender marker on my citizenship certificate. I can't change my name and gender on my educational certificate. And having those documents, I cannot access to education. So saying that the narrative that comes across that transgender people can access can have their documents issued in their preferred name and preferred gender is false. It's wrong. Also, the 2007 landmark did not address this because it only addressed the fact that there should be a third gender option. But again, saying that, a lot of people who would prefer having a third gender marker can also because again it will date back to their birth certificate, so it's very likely for them to also have their gender assigned at birth. So even if there is a third gender option, people cannot really access legally access this third gender option as well. And it really depends on the loopholes, like if you know this person who in the authority who's issuing citizenship certificate or blah blah blah. Sorry. Saying that, I'd also like to talk about the different waves of LGBTIQ movement in Nepal. The first wave started in 2001 that most of you have probably read in news media. In around 2017 and 2018. Oh, okay. So maybe I'll come back to this, the waves of LGBTIQ movement in the second round. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Rukshana, to have given a very concise overview of the struggles of our community members in Nepal. That was very insightful. I now, many of the points that you shared, you and Arita shared about the differences in the way laws are configured in the hierarchies that Arita spoke of. We weren't even aware that the constitution doesn't reign supreme in Sri Lanka, and there are many geopolitical legal differences. And on that note of a difference within the Indian subcontinent and the nations within the Indian subcontinent in terms of geopolitics and political legal landscape as they contest that terrain, I call upon our friend and panelist Tashi Teshen from Bhutan to share how the journey's been like in Bhutan. Tashi, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, it's Tashi only. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone here. So my name is Tashi, and I'm running 27 years old, and I'm from Bhutan. Most of you know we are just around roughly 700,000 population, so quite a very small country compared to everyone in the region. Our journey. Let us talk about I'll very quick and very precise. I don't want to take much of your time. So the decriminalization process, the legal, the legislative, the parliamentary process is ongoing, which was done last year in 2019 June, when the National Assembly or the lower house unanimously voted to scrape the law. We also have a similar law, same as Sri Lanka and India. Ours is called Section 213. It has the same language. It calls because they use the same language such as sodomy and unnatural offenses. So it's more or less copy pasted legislation from India and Sri Lanka. We have never been colonized by British, but you can say that the laws, especially the penal code of Bhutan, is more or less copy pasted from the Indian penal code of Bhutan. They're just the sections are different. So the section 213 and 214, which is basically the sodomy law, was unanimously repealed in the lower house in 2019 in the summer parliamentary sessions. But when it came to the upper house, which is the National Council, they had some issues with the law. The National Council said repealing of the law is not how we should do, because unnatural sex can be defined, is a very big subject, and it does not criminalizes the LGBTI population as a whole. But we as a community, and I as someone who have actually led community for the last 5 years, know our realities are different on the ground. But then again, it did not change. It came back. It came back early this year to the National Assembly for approval again. And more or less, just to say that both the houses are in total disagreement with the laws. The lower house is saying the law should be repealed. The law should be scrapped. The law should not be there at all. The upper house is saying the law should be there, but with modifications. So what basically the upper house is saying that even uh, what the upper house in plain text says is that consensual same-sex activity is legal as long as it happens in bedroom, and it happens in the bedroom. So they are more or less they are interpreting in a ways that it is legal as long as you do it in a very private manner, which is very confusing for us as a community member. Even law enforcers, we deal with a lot of law enforcers as well, police, and even the police thinks this law should not be there, and it's also very confusing for us. I'm frankly, I may speak very vaguely, but because I'm not a legal expert here, I can only bring in community experiences which I have lived and share stories which my friends have shared so far. Our problem is not with the legal system, the parliament, or the police, or the justice system. They are not our issues. Our issues are with the societies and how people perceive us. And going forward, we are trying to change attitudes of people, how people perceive us. We had a few clashes with the police as well, of transgender friends being arrested, not for being transgender or anything else related to the LGBTI, but they were arrested because they were doing other stuff like illegal, they were doing drug trafficking and all. But then again, the police were very sensitive enough to ensure their safety, to ask them in which prison cells do you want to go, whether you prefer the male prisons or whether you prefer the female prisons. And they would often call my network in Bhutan to consult with us on how to sensitivity with the community when they come in conflict with law. So we are in quite a good place legally, but at the same time, the community tries to take advantage of the current. They try to take advantage of it, and it does not go well sometimes, and it often. Well, it's a very different scenario to go through. In terms of recognition, we have 6 or 7 transgender women who have actually successfully changed their legal gender legal gender markers on their identity card. So they just have the process is very individual. You have to go through your own. There's no policy in place in the Home Ministry on how to gender to change gender. but as individuals, you can go to a psychiatrist, bring a note from the psychiatrist, and bring a note from an organization who can actually vouch for you, saying that you are a transgender individual. So as long as you have these two documents and support, your gender markers can be changed. And we have 6 or 7 of them who are transgender. All of them are transgender, who have actually successfully changed their gender markers. But and I guess we have one intersex person whose gender markers were changed based on his preference, and a transgender man also changed his gender markers as male. So our primary document is the citizenship identity card. You are given a card, which is the which is the primary document. As long as you have your gender markers and your names change on that document, everything else can be changed, like your voter ID, your passport. You just need your citizenship identity card, which is the primary document in my country. So as long as you have that, everything else will fall in line. Uh, so we are just in the process of making that as a formality, as a policy in our Ministry of Home. As long as we do that, everything else will come in place. So they don't require any hormone therapy or sex reassignment surgery. It's just you just need, like I said, a note from the psychiatrist affirming your gender identity, and and a document which someone signs in your support saying that you are a transgender man or a transgender woman. So these are the two documents, especially for the transgender community. And not, but then again, many people don't know about these processes. It's because we are a very small country and our narratives are mostly driven by our neighbors, which is basically India. So basically, I can speak Hindi and understand Hindi because we go around the whole scenario of Bollywood. So very common to that. And our media narratives has been mostly driven by India as well, especially in terms of LGBTI movement. We hear stories of people being raped, kidnapped, harassed, and in my country, my community also assumes the same thing, that people will do. Uh, they might face the same thing if they come out in the open, and oftentimes it has been true for some of them. And 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 many people won't go to the legal process of seeking justice. I've never heard or never came across someone who has actually gone through the justice system, going through the courts, especially in terms of their rights violation. They always fear. People understand that they have this. We have this section 213 and 214, the sodomy law, which actually criminalizes consensual same-sex activity. So they fear criminalization, even though in reality it may or may not happen, but they fear it. So that's why most of the people, they like to stay in the closet. And believe me when I say this, that the closet in my country is very comfortable right now. So that's one of the challenges for me and my network. So whenever we try to work with policy individuals, people in position to make this changes, they always often ask for numbers, and people, they want to see more faces of the community, and we cannot bring those faces out because they are very comfortable in the way they are living right now. The closet is a very comfortable space, especially for gay men, lesbian, even for cisgender people, except for transgender people. They are some of them are visible, so for them they have to fight their way through. Uh, Visibility is not often a visibility can be very problematic for them sometimes. For education is if we look at the education system, the transgender population suffers the most. Bhutan is branded as the land of happiness. We we use happiness as a slogan and we call ourselves the happiest country in the world. It's not. I always tend to disagree with that statement. If we were happiest country in the world, I wouldn't be. We wouldn't be doing this form of activism in and around the country, talking about our. Basically, we don't. I'm not really sure how to say this, but we don't. We are not really into activism. We are more into creating awareness and building linkages with people. That's how we go. That's how we are doing things here in Bhutan. So basically, having connecting with people to people, bringing in allies who can support us, strong allies who have very good linkages with people in the parliament as well as the lawmakers. This is something that we are doing in my country. It is also doable for us because we are a very small country. Like I said, we only have like 700,000 population in the country. It's a very small nation, and basically everyone knows everyone one way or the other. So this is the most easiest way for us to do it, which is going through the parliamentarians themselves and not go through the legal system. Uh, our for the next, if I envision ourselves as the whole LGBTI movement in the country, I also don't like to use the term as the whole LGBTI population in my country because we don't have lesbian representation in my network because lesbians are very comfortable in the closets right now. I wouldn't blame them for staying in the closet. It's their space and their right to be. If they're comfortable, you should enjoy their spaces. Um, we only have gay men, cisgender gay men, queer, transgender men and women, and I only heard a few stories from intersex community, but I have never met or seen one intersex people in my country. So visibility is often a problem for us. So one of our issues and one of the concerns that I have is that our narratives, the whole LGBT narrative, is driven by cisgender gay men and few transgender people, and we may get it right across, and we may not get it right. So that's one of the issues that we are dealing with right now, and 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 one of the uh, well, our situation is very complex, especially for me. Whenever I do this kind of talk, especially in panels, I always have difficulty explaining our situation and our context. So one of the things that I find it very difficult to do is getting to the parliamentarians at sometimes because oh, the legal system. When we talk about the legal system, they always there's this very there's a very vague concept that they always assume the sodomy law with our rape laws in our countries. Our rape laws are very strong in the country and very comprehensive and very gender friendly. So they provide. So we don't have very he she in our rape laws. It says they them. It's a very gender neutral rape law. But the parliamentarians' arguments, whenever we talk about repealing of sodomy law or Section 210, 214, they always say that people who go through rape may be affected because if we repeal this law. But if we but but they fail to understand that the rape laws are very different from the sodomy law. The sodomy is in the penal code of Bhutan, and the rape laws are a very different law. So they always make this argument of comparing these two laws. So these are one of the challenges that we face, and oftenly I wouldn't blame them because the parliamentarians do not come from a legal background, and they may or may not have the understanding of the community itself and the legal system itself. So, mm, so I guess this is for now. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that overview of the struggle in your country, Tashi. We'll have another very brief round for each of the panelists to give their thoughts further. And now, I would urge Dr. Dhiren Borisa to share thoughts on the complexities and inadequacies of the particularly the Navdeep Singh Johar judgment in a country like India where there are where there are many forms of social exclusions, right from age to caste, class, disability, and so on, HIV status. Um, while this is a baby step, and it's a baby step nevertheless, but it's not the be all and end all of it. So I, particularly because your research has been more around spaces and habitations, and while the trans habitations, the trans spaces are very significantly different from the Gharana, the Haveli systems are very different from the other spaces of, say, cisgender income receiving, salary receiving person. So may I urge you to take over and share your thoughts, insights on all of this, please? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vaijayanti, and thank you, Nalsar, for inviting me. Yeah, I often, I'm here for everybody who is celebrating 2 years of the verdict, Navtej Singh Johar verdict. So when I was asked, and I'm going to mostly read because I often end up missing out a lot of things that I want to say. So I'm going to read, so bear with me. When I was asked in the mail that invited me to the panel to share stories and issues from India among these powerful voices from South Asian queer community and movement, I'm afraid I can only represent an unpopular opinion in the queer movement. I can only share stories from a vantage point of a Dalit queer person. My humblest apologies if it doesn't feel celebratory enough of the Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India, but like courtrooms, often acquitting the perpetrators of caste violence that many in my communities face, I want to put across that LGBT movement, or what comes to be known as gay agenda, works for us no different than these courtrooms. Our lives beyond the law are more complex, and tactical moves that lawyers adopt to win cases are often an erasure of these complexities. So be it. In 2018, when the victory was achieved, let's all remember which voices were foregrounded and which voices were removed from the petitions. How respectability was played up through the caste and class privileges of certain petitioners, and how sex workers were asked to tone down or better leave. What does it tell about law and justice? What does it speak about rights and citizenship? Who can claim them? What does it tell about us as a queer movement? Many promise of a magical trickle down, or as rights will mystically fall through a top-down approach. We are told there's a hierarchy of oppressions. Everybody will bear its fruits. This trickle down is a false hope. Queer movements like our courtrooms seldom care about everyone, but only few who deserve, and I quote, deserve, and emphasize on it, justice and rights. Many of us are just residuals. Rights sieve through our bodies, do not touch us in same ways as judgments promise. I'll just say we are tired of being the residual of the queer movement. We'll not be the residual of this movement. This movement is ours to claim. If sheer numbers are to be taken, a false premise that even queers were offended with in 2013 Suresh Kumar Kaushal judgment, when the judges asked in the courtrooms to the lawyers if they knew any gays. Because the judge definitely didn't. To declare what then we should worry about for the rights of this so-called minuscule minority. If we take the same logic ahead, just because visibility for cisgendered gay bodies comes with privilege and access, and the visibility of trans and non-conforming bodies results in routinized violence, as Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi queers, then we know where our solidarities lie. For we have been historically denied this respectability on the backs of which this victory was the victory we celebrate. Many of us, you won't see in your fancy parties that imagine inclusivity through gatekeeping. Some of us might get entry because we have claimed some access through education, can wear fancy clothes, and still hiding our social locations to claim desirability. If sheer numbers are to be taken, then as proportion to the share in the population, Dalits, Bahujan, Adivasis should also make the majority of the queer population. But we cannot be visible. Some of us cannot afford the same means through which queerness is now globally legible. Many of us, you do not want to see and touch because it takes away your glamour. Many of us, you kill and humiliate because they are trans, while all of us continue to live in the shadows of the humiliation that you serve us every day through caste. This movement is not queer, till it's for everyone. Angela Davis called for intersectionality of struggles against intersectionality of identities. It's only there where true celebration lies. On a pride mailing list of a major city in this country, there's disdain for the anti-caste flag on why you carried it in the pride. Quote, why do you dilute the queer movement by bringing in caste and misplace our agendas that should rightly focus on gay suicides, adoption rights, and blood donations? Unquote. All of which are important issues. So are housing and labor rights and dignity. And none of them are mutually exclusive from the various other marginalities that amplify these issues. When one creates such hierarchies, we are again treated as a residue, again erased and asked to leave the party. Lest you forget that we are also queer, and lest you forget that if it was not for a Dalit person writing the constitution of this country and ensuring the possibility for the judges of the 2018 to grant us what we celebrate today, there would have been no rights to celebrate tonight. In another major city pride, when few students raised slogans against the ruling regime's Citizenship Amendment Act that excludes one particular minority, and the elder gay activist testified against these students as seditious and anti-national, to distance from such voices that taint the rainbow flag, which symbolizes diversity. Let me remind you, in the humblest way possible, it doesn't remain rainbow anymore. Though saffron is a beautiful color, your flag is saffron but drips of crimson blood. That in the same moment, a minority we claim ourselves to be, when we seek from law sexual citizenship, we have minoritized our own people, erased those who are also queer. The queer movement is not just in the pride parades and parties, but in the long roads that migrants walked to go back home during the pandemic. Many of them who would have queer desires, that their lives, by virtue of their precarity, are already queer. The state doesn't care about them like it doesn't for us. It just cares for a minuscule minority that can easily be co-opted by the global neoliberal nation state. The queer movement lies in the protests of Shaheen Bagh, where Muslim women, like many of us who dread but feel free when we go to our prides, were protesting against denial of citizenship. Today, when we celebrate 2 years of some kind of citizenship and recognition we earned through law, let's not forget there's no difference in their rights and our rights, except the distances we want to create and maintain. I'm sure many today listening this would feel, isn't the next natural step to fight for gay marriages? Like the two powerful queer lawyers from upper caste background who in an Oxford Union address declared, much like the United States Supreme Court order in Obergefell versus Hodges granting the right to marriage. What do marriages mean in Indian context? I want to bring in Dr. Ambedkar again and his lecture at Columbia University on Genesis of Caste, where he vocally states that caste is endogamy. When our queer spaces and modes of desire are already shaped through caste, class, and other power dimensions, what change is gay marriage going to bring? But strengthening of the caste regime. Don't we always fall for the rich and classy, the well-dressed in the party, the presentable and the respectable, all of which comes from caste and class histories? Don't we see people on Grindr flaunting their caste identities, where Jat and Gujjar in North India and Reddy and Gowda in some parts in the South become markers of sexiness in desirable bodies? What difference will the demand for marriage bring but a celebration of respectability through maintenance of the caste pride? Last year, when we celebrated 1 year of this victory, trans people were fighting for the right for self-determination against a bill that claimed to protect them but didn't feel necessary to include them. 2 days before the Delhi Pride, a protest is called at the same place where the Pride culminates. Only 30 people show up to this protest against the 7,000 people that walk in pride celebrating this very Navteej Singh Johar judgment. Where are our priorities? Where is the queer movement? Is the celebration of this verdict just celebration of a moment and not just not a movement? Because for sure, it has erased the contributions of trans people and sex workers and women's movement and anti-caste movement to make this moment possible. When the LGBT pride can conveniently choose to ignore the T that it draws and makes part of its acronym, I dare say, I have very little faith that would remember the Dalits, Bahojans, Adivasis, and Muslim that make a majority in all of these categories. As the Combahee River Collective Statement said in 1977, nobody of us is free till each one of us is. I will end with, because we are often asked to show numbers, and Tashi spoke about numbers and how numbers are so important and why people do not show up numbers for certain kinds of protests and certain kinds of movements. Some of us are always minoritized. When we seek justice from courtrooms and movements we're deeply invested in. This is my poetic response. Because many of us, even when want to, cannot afford to come to your parties because you do not want us to. Yet again today, you pulled me down to numbers. Yet again today, you pulled me down to numbers, you choked my throat and silenced me like every other time with names that did not resonate, I could relate to. Which told me, rather reminded me that I do not belong here, in the spaces which I otherwise inhabit or the bodies which I otherwise inhabit. Till the time I can also produce with me an army of numbers like the ones that walk the streets as if they own them, forgetful of what and why gives them this privilege, this power to tell me that I will never have it, or do I even need them? So that's it. So that's it, isn't it? Till then, I should be silent, let the norms have the last laugh. Why don't I just fuck off? Yet again today, like every other day, you pulled me down, you pushed me away, you walked over me, my bodies, our bodies, visible bodies, invisibilized bodies. Dead, alive, how does it matter? Matters is your walk. Matters is a walk that overlooks my kind like a warrior does. Such is the privilege of distance, my friend, you won't understand. Just tail and nibs of your rainbow feathers. What about us? You call your intimate. But others, thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much. It was a very soul-stirring talk, which has left, at least me, it has left me with goosebumps on my body. And I must admit that in the last few months and quarters, I have undergone what was quoted in an earlier judgment of the Supreme Court, the chilling effect on democracy. So I have very unwillingly, but with a heavy heart, learned to coexist with virulent forms of structural violence. So I'm so extremely grateful to you, Dr. Dhiren Bhuris. You have rekindled those sparks and reignited those sparks. At the same time, before I pass it over to the next panelist, to be able to be that what's the word, trenchant and strident in one's critique of the state requires a whole lot of courage, one. Two, some level of courage coupled also with privilege, because the chilling effect that the last few quarters and perhaps a few years have had has literally decimated the last shreds of courage people were clinging on to. So I'm not able to elaborate over this with more examples because the chilling effect is deep and runs like a rot throughout. So on that note, again, thank you very, 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 very much. And I would now call upon our friend, 1 minute, my phone is just frozen. Hang on, just, I'm so sorry. Oh, whoa. Now, my apologies, just bear with me. Yes, our friend Mohammed Salman Khan from Pakistan, welcome to the panel. And I hand over the mantle to you to take us through the journey of struggles in your part of the world.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is Salman, and well, originally I'm from Pakistan, but lately I would say I've been in exile, and it's not a pretty reason why I've chosen exile also. And on this platform, I would be going ahead and detailing some of the reasons of that, and overall what's happening even in Pakistan, for example. So I've been a journalist and an activist, one of the only openly gay, actually. And this is not something that I brag about. I wish I had a bragging rights for that. And in Pakistan, for example, the situation is quite different from what is in India. India seems to be a heaven, for example. What's happening in India, I know there are issues um, very beautifully elaborated by the last speaker. And of course, there are caste issues and many others. And I'm not here to comment on India and what's happening in India and how even it's worsening in situation of the Hindutva nationalism, what's happening in Kashmir and many other parts with Dalit and also the Muslim minorities. But in Pakistan, the situation is that we have our own, barriers, socio-legal barriers, cultural barriers, political barriers, for example. Even for me, for example, as a queer activist, it came out of accident. It came out of necessity for for even existing, because in Pakistan, even now, even in 2020, the whole entire concept of queer people, for example, existing does not exist. Well, we do exist in slangs, the same Hindi, the G word, which I would not take. Well, that is what is used to define queer people, queer existence. But then again, it it's still it's still it's still not acknowledged. It's still not acknowledged even in media. We have English speaking media. We are, of course, a creation of um, the fallout of the British going ahead and partitioning the subcontinent, and how India came into existence, and we were divided on religion. Um, Pakistan, for example, still continues to move ahead with its 157-year-old British colonial law, the same Section 377. It's the exact same thing that India has. Whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal will be punished with imprisonment of for life, or with imprisonment of 2 years or more than 10 years. And it is enforced. The enforcement cases are also, they depend, but at the same time, the criminality of queer existence itself creates a lot of hurdle. In organizing, in activism, for example, in my years of 5 years plus, organizing, trying to do our best to even exist and create platforms and spaces was incredibly difficult. We had seen that how our secret services were always there around places because they were suspicious of our activities. And what's happening now, even in Pakistan, for example, just a recent, for example, court case that I would take out from August 8th. It was, people can go ahead and Google it also. It's like same sex um, marriage Um, it's about same-sex marriage. So the case goes around of how there was this trans man who married a cis woman, their lover, and how unfortunately then the cases were filed against them by the parents of the girl, and then first they were fine. They were able to go ahead and um, say that they had the computerized identity card to go ahead and present the validity of their transition. For example, there are trans men. Bear in mind, Pakistan does recognizes trans people, trans women and trans men. I would be going into that, but the thing is that the case had gradually reached to a point that they were that they didn't showed up for the court hearings, which of course nobody would. In Pakistan, for example, you could be killed at court proceedings, right? You don't trust the law. The law is on your not on your side. So of course, I do understand what the person might be going through. They were facing an arrest. They were told to be produced before the court by August 17. I have no further details until now of what is happening. And so it's a same-sex marriage case of how this person who is a trans man, but it's been seen as a homosexual, and how they were being even told to produce a gender test, which is incredibly regressive of how the state is policing sexuality and LGBT identities according to its own narrative. So again, then this is one of an incredibly saddening case that had happened of how even trans men, despite having legal protection now in Pakistan, for example, in 2009, the Supreme Court recognized that trans people exist, they have rights. This was 2009. And also that they would have national identity cards. This went for some time, but eventually it was 2018, in fact, May 8, 2018, just before what the verdict was produced in India, decriminalizing homosexuality. Pakistan actually went ahead with a very progressive legislation, at least on paper, it looks good, for the rights of trans people. Bear in mind, it's trans women and men and intersex even. But as usual, there's no mention of queer people, because homosexuality in our culture, in particular Pakistan culture, conservative Muslim culture, is considered a sin and is a no-no. Pakistan being Islamic country on paper would not be willing to move ahead with decriminalizing in my lifetime. I would say it would not happen. We never even touched the subject because it was too controversial. So yeah, moving ahead, but like Pakistan has made progress when it comes to trans rights, and it's an entire movement that spans over decades, um, which resulted over the 2018 verdict, which is to be celebrated. Honestly, I have a trans sibling. She's an activist also. She's doing good. And me myself in my queer struggle activism, I've been empowered a lot by trans women and how resilient they are towards and it's a whole entire same hijra, or we call it Khwaja Sara in Urdu, Khwaja Sara culture, and how it was able to organize, how it was able to campaign for rights, and they were able to achieve it. But at the same time, what we are seeing is a worsening situation when it comes to um, how the state itself is criminalizing coexistence. Just on 11th August 2020, this Thursday, the PTA, which is the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, had banned Grinder. So yes, for now, Grinder is banned in Pakistan, and this is the better that this is the situation, that we can't even compare ourselves to what's happening in India. India, despite its own political and economic hurdles that might exist, is progressing, if I would say from a Pakistani perspective, in LGBTQ rights. But of course, Pakistan is in a very worse situation because Grindr, um, for example, and even Tinder and three other apps have been banned for immoral and indecent content. Can you imagine in 2020 a state policing of how what apps we can use and where we can organize. So even existence on social media, on online portals itself is a huge risk. I know from my journey, for example, which openly and publicly stands for like 5 years, but before that also I've been ostracized by my extended family. They don't want me. Many of them are settled in Canada and US. In fact, they don't want me. They don't, I'm dead to them. So, um, and then you have a society, for example, a lot of I know who are my so-called friends or whatever, colleagues, they distance themselves. In fact, I've even received death threats from people I knew. So it was a life of extreme trauma, which still exists and persists. For example, if you're born in a very conservative um, Muslim culture, for example, as a queer person, as a trans person, so your own people, for example, would not only not acknowledge your existence, they would try their best to erase you as from the face of the earth, what I call it. So that is what is happening in Pakistan. In Pakistan also in 2018, at the same time, December 13, in fact, just after the verdict that happened in India, the government revoked the license of 18 foreign funded organizations, which one of them included Open Society. And Open Society is very well known for like supporting LGBT causes and projects in countries like Pakistan. And I met one of their regional coordinators also in DC, and the same thing that they're banned. So this and one of the pretexts that came about that was circulated widely was also that they're promoting homosexuality, which of course is not a good thing in my country, my culture, my people. So living living in Pakistan, for example, um, yeah. So in its entirety, what's happening, for example, in India, is a beacon of hope, and I am grateful also of and I wholeheartedly appreciate that even there's been an initiative to invite someone from Pakistan, because our queer voices are not heard. And for example, India progressed all sort of a lot of grassroots activism. There were openly gay writers and authors and whatnot. In Pakistan, that never happened. We are struggling still. Even the media representation is often questionable. For example, a recent series that was released, in fact, in India, I would like to share a little bit. And if it's fine, can you tell me how much time do I have? But yeah, that was released in India, for example. It's a very incredible, radical, progressive feminist series, but at the same time, it's queer representation, for example, that came about. It's called Else. It was released on Z5. Is questionable in terms of how it it dehumanized to some extent, I would say. It represented lesbian relationship in a positive light, which is a good thing. A trans character was added, tokenized, in fact, I would say. Queer men, closeted. One was, in fact, it's a drama, it's a psycho thriller, and was butchered by the wife for allegedly cheating on her, which is, well, I know a lot of people, which is, for them it's not easy to be, to even accept that they're queer. So in Pakistan, we're seeing a very troubling time. And I remember the verdict that happened and that was passed, and I had tears. Still remember September 6th, 2018, and I had tears that finally something of this magnitude had happened. And India plays an important role, believe it or not, despite a regional rivalry influencing Pakistan. And of course, it would not influence immediately like we would be like having prides or something. Prides is not what I say also what can be the best solution. But even rights, for example, our human rights are being not recognized, which is quite troubling, and we continue to face that. Pride, for example, one in 2012, there was an event by a U.S. embassy, and that resulted in like the Islamists, storming, well, outside, protesting at the embassy because they wanted to have this Pride event. So we need indigenous grassroots and quite an intersectional activism on the ground, but it's becoming harder because what's happening in Pakistan is um, complete and utter um, um, disregard, I would say, censorship of even the discourse, even a mere hint of LGBT, for example, can trigger a lot of controversy, and it's not safe. It's becoming harder. And for me, for example, that even as an activist, I was forced to leave and choose exile, which is quite hard, is because of how there have been people who were not only opposed, but also they have filed defamation case, and defamation case can lead to criminal sentences for, well, defaming everything, country to religion. And that's why um, I've chosen this life of an exile, which itself is hard. And yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you ever so much for taking us through the intersection of struggles that you and friends in Pakistan are facing. We really hope, I personally hope, and many of us here would really wish that there is peace and that there is acceptance and inclusion in the entire world, and particularly across the Indian subcontinent, not just India, but across all the other countries in the Indian subcontinent. On that note of thanks and gratitude, I'll now move on and welcome our next panelist, sister and friend. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Maaf kijega if I'm mispronouncing it. Ho Chi Minh Islam, is that correct? Am I mispronouncing it? And my apologies if I have.
It's okay. Thank you so much. My name is Ho Chi Minh Islam, and good afternoon from Bangladesh. Um, Thank you so much, Nalsar Public Policy Group, for making such a wonderful discussion based on queerness and law. I can't talk about any other identities or spectrum for being living in Bangladesh, and it's not easy to talk about any other identities. I do work for transgender rights, and I'll only talk about trans rights in Bangladesh. Because this is Muslim majority country, there is a lots of problems around us. So we can't talk openly about gender identities, sexual identities. It will be trouble. And I think there's 4 or 5 countries representative here today, but the most miserable situation is in Bangladesh. So I'm gonna talking about, and I'll try to talk about the journey of transgender movements in Bangladesh. in 2013, state make a resolution which they told that hijra are recognized as a as a third gender. So there is a problem because hijra is not a gender. As far we know, hijra is a culture. So and they told that hijra as a transgender. And then what happened in Bangladesh after 2013? Government take an initiative to employ the hijra community, so-called transgender, so-called third gender communities people as like traffic police. Then they decide to make a medical test. Based on this, they want to identify who is or who are real hijra or fake hijra. And such nasty things happen that times. So bad attitude and the things did the state and the state policymaker in that time. They thought that hijra means they can't marry. Hijra means they don't have like family. They make a definition based on their thoughts, and this was a problem during that time to employ the third gender, so-called that word third gender as a employee. And there is also another problem. Some religious leader still recognize that this is a psychiatric problem. This is a illness, so people can cure from this, and this is not a normal thing. And being transgender peoples in Bangladesh, I faced many criminal offense that happened with me in few days ago, but I didn't go to the law enforcement agency because what I would tell them about my identity if I want to make a GD or whatever it is. So I have to recognize myself as a man, woman, or transgender or what. So state still don't recognize transgender peoples in Bangladesh. So there is a problem also. And if we think about law, the British colonial law, which made by the British Empire on 18th centuries, that still exist in our country. So even no one can talk about this section or this laws, because if someone want to talk, then the religious leader and the state will think that they are like anti-religious people who are going to make some hatred for the religion. So this is the problems. And if we think about the political involvement, there's few activists from hijra and transgender community try to come in politics, but our ruling party in the last election, they mentioned and they told that if they want to take the transgender and hijra people in to take in politics, they need to change their political manifesto and constitution. So men and women can join the politics without any facing any discrimination. Being trans and being a hijra, if you want to come in politics, then they told and they shows that they need to change their manifesto and constitution. So such a hypocrisy things happened around us. And I want to say another thing about there is a lots of NGOs and donor agencies who are interested to work with these issues. There is an NGO which have a great role to play and to talk, to work about gender and sexual diversities. They are making some policy, gender policy. So my question is that, like, who are making this kind of policies? Who are the policy maker? Cis men and women sitting in that top position, and they are making policy for us. So these kind of questions came, and we see this. There is a lots of discrimination still happens, even in the intellectual, between the intellectual society. And if we talk about the transphobia, there is phobia inside the communities. Even in some transgender peoples, activist community peoples, also they have there some kind of intersectionality. And they are also being trans, after being trans, they are also phobic about transphobia. They make certain definition, you have to be like this, you need to put yourself in a box, and you need to maintain certain markers, then you can be a true transgender. And I want to talk another one thing is that such kind of research is still happened in West and even in our South Asian region, which make some backlash and create an obstacle for these communities, which really, really pathetic, I want to say. And another thing I want to say that this kind of conversation is not going to end in one conversation. We need to sit more and more, and we need to talk these issues and things more and more. And I think this is a global fight. It's not like that in our country, if that section gone and rights came, that means I'm like free and I got my freedom. It's not like that. I think this is a global fight, and we need to think, we need to talk, we need to make ally, we need to make some network around our region and around the country, beyond the country. So then it will be very helpful for all of us. And another thing is that I want to say that this is not the rights for the certain people. It's not like being trans rights is belong only to me. It's not like that. It's belong every single human being who exist in this universe. If a lady or if a man tomorrow or 10 years later or so many days later can give birth a child, before giving a birth to a child, how can they ensure that their child will be male or female, or nothing will be happened with them? So if no one can assure them before, so I want to say that this rights is for all the human beings. It's not for only for the certain or particular communities or the peoples. So I don't want to take any more time. I want to quit right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much, Sister Ho Chi Minh Islam, for that overview of the differences and the struggles in your part and your part of the world and country. It gives a different it gives us different perspectives from coming from different spaces in our continent. Now we have some time left, and I'd like to hand it over to each of the panelists, just in case they have some thoughts left. May I request you to take a minute to two each for you to end with closing thoughts, and perhaps we'll just take two questions, only two questions from the audience after you give your one or two. So we could start now with, in the same sequence, we could start with Arita.
Hi, thank you. I just want to, especially considering we are celebrating 2 years since the Indian decriminalization judgment, one of the things which we have been really inspired by for possible action in Sri Lanka was in parts of the judgment, which was essentially a reading down of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. And that reading down was not to declare that the entire Section 377 was unconstitutional, but so far as it applies to consenting same-sex adults, persons, that aspect was unconstitutional, and that consensual relations between same-sex persons, that is homosexual relations, was not unnatural, because that was part of the debate in that judgment, where there were arguments presented saying that homosexual relations was unnatural, and the judgment was quite clear, saying actually it's not. It's part of the natural spectrum of human sexuality and human existence, and homosexuality is a behavior which is prevalent in all species, not just unique to humans. So that unnaturalness was really the argument of unnaturalness was really destroyed through that judgment. And I think that's really a strong part of the judgment which we can hear and which we are currently exploring to take up in a court case in Sri Lanka, is that not for the court to declare that, say, our Section 365 is unconstitutional, but that same-sex consensual relations is not unnatural, that homosexual sexual relations and emotional romantic relations is not carnal intercourse against the order of nature. And if we can convince the court to make that judgment, especially based on the precedents created in India, I think we can still see a judicial-based decriminalization of same-sex relations. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Rita. Rukshana, any closing thoughts for just a minute or two? Rukshana?
Yeah, so I would like to add that a lot of narrative, a lot of things that come in the international media about Nepal is very exclusionary, it's very hegemonic, and it really does not address like all the diverse narratives that are from Nepal. Yeah, I think in terms of whatever is happening, there's like, whatever is the context in Nepal, there is a lot of activism happening around. And recently, on 31st March 2020, we for the first time introduced the National Charter of National Transgender Demand Sheet that talked about transgender men and women who'd like to take male or female and not the third gender option. And we also came out on 17 May 2020, National Charter of Demands on Legal Recognition of Gender Identity, which talks about more comprehensive gender recognition for intersex, transgender, non-binary, and also third gender folks, and also people who want to opt out mentioning gender at all. So saying that, I think there's very little things that you hear from younger population. There's very little things that you hear apart from one particular organization. So I think it's important for us when we talk about Nepal to hear from all these different narratives and all these different backgrounds. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. Over to you, Tashi, a minute or two. Tashi?
Thank you. Just 2 or 3 points. With the categorization of having others as gender in Nepal, so our lawmakers basically recommend us to take up this other category as for the transgender population, but we strictly rejected that. I'm not saying just as a cisgender gay man, but the whole transgender population, especially the transgender women, they strongly objected to that classification. They said it's a very stigmatizing, and it further promotes classification of transgender into a other category other than being female. So the whole transgender population strongly opposes those classifications as other. And when we had decriminalization in the lower house last year, India was India was voted by our finance minister, who actually brought up the legislation, legislation. He was actually the one who proposed decriminalization and revoking the whole section. So he actually referred to India as a country to look upon. So progressive progress that happens in the region, it also ripples into other countries as well. So India was the whole decriminalization in India was also a boon for us. So boon for us, and also you will not hear. Just to clarify, you will not hear a lot about the whole LGBT movement in Bhutan. You will not hear about activism. You will not hear about us going on the streets. You will not hear us about writing a lot of a lot of blogs, doing a lot of activism. It's because we do things very quietly, we do things very subtly. We believe in one-to-one advocacy. We do a lot of internal advocacy. We bring in a lot of public support, not just through media campaigns, but we do one-to-one advocacy, and that has been our core strategy from the beginning, especially starting from 2014 and 2015, and we are still continuing to do that because we are doing that because it has worked for us. Uh, and I guess as long as these things, and we are making quite a progress over the years. So as long as we are still continuing to do a lot of stuff internally. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. To you, Dr. Dhiren Borisa.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Vajanti. Probably my response is going to be your response to my small presentation. It's about how do we do intersectional politics? How do we coexist? Like learning to coexist. And I would like to start with a story. Because we are in pandemic, sexuality has been cut down. There's hardly you're allowed to move around at the risk of spreading corona, and that's we need to be committed to nation's health in some way or other. I get a message on Tinder by somebody I randomly matched who said, you know, it's a Muslim sounding name. It's a Muslim name. He says that, you know, we have learned to live like this. Now I'm astonished why this person is saying, and it's with what Vajanti was trying to tell us, that how some of us cannot afford to resist. Some of us do not have those privileges and to continue fighting because the way in which state has come down hounding us. This boy lived in Jafrabad. Jafrabad in February, northeast Delhi, was boiling through the strong voices of Muslim women that had taken over a road and peacefully protesting to a sit-in, but which was then triggered by certain political leaders from dominant right-wing regime who insinuated and threatened for a pogrom, which actually resulted in a state-led pogrom where a lot of people were murdered, mostly from Muslim communities. What unfurled and what this boy was referring to me on Tinder, saying that we have learned to live like this, is that some of his friends who were peacefully protesting in those protests were also lifted up by the police. They did not know where they were taken, which police station. Most of them did not have the support network. Then most of the, if Keshav Suri or Ritu Dalmia gets arrested, even if 377 was there, they would have enough support system to follow up on their cases and their rights. But what it also resonated with what another Kashmiri gay boy told me on another dating app, saying that, you know, I've now got internet, but and when I say like, oh, this lockdown of pandemic must be disastrous, to tell me and remind me precisely at that point that, you know, what harm is this pandemic doing? We have learned to live like this. This is nothing. We don't care about it anymore. What worse can it happen than what is already there? That we remember, we need to remind ourselves that A, none of our lives are indispensable. B, that while in 2018 this verdict was being declared, just a year before it, in 2017, on 5th of September, one progressive journalist was shot dead outside our house in Bangalore, Gauri Lankesh. And the way in which, since Bhima Koregaon happened, the way in which particular kind of activists and voices are being cut down and stifled, it is more to tell us about, to remind us That state is more interested in stifling our voices and instigate fear, and we stop speaking. In Audre Lorde, in Litany of Survival, said that we were never supposed to speak. If we speak, we are punished. Death comes to us. But when we are not speaking, even then death comes to us. Then why don't just speak? Why don't just tell? I'll end with a short poem. It's in Hindi, but I'll give you an English translation also, which three of us read on 2015 on Delhi Queer Pride stage, where we talked about you need to also recognize caste as a question of queer politics. But it's about speaking, it's about resistance, and we need it more than ever today. कौन समझेगा और कौन नहीं? कौन समझेगा और कौन नहीं? किस भाषा में बोलूं तुमको जो भाव लिखे इस कविता में? शब्दों को उनका भान नहीं, मेरी कविताएं पर मौन नहीं. कुछ अनसुलझे ही बेहतर हैं, कुछ अनसुलझे ही बेहतर हैं. क्यों पोल में खोलूं शब्दों की? कब मुझको ये अधिकार मिला कि भाषा बोलूं शब्दों की? हर शख्स यहां पर कवि श्रेष्ठ, हर शख्स यहां पर कवि श्रेष्ठ. हर शब्द ये बोले कविता है. कौन हूं मैं जो बोलूं कुछ की किसने बोला कौन नहीं? मेरी कविताएं पर मौन नहीं. सत्ता के शीर्ष पर बैठे तुम, सत्ता के शीर्ष पर बैठे तुम, चाहे जितनी हुंकार भरो अपनी फौजों के हाथों में, चाहे जितने हथियार धरो. मैं मर जाऊंगा शायद पर, मैं मर जाऊंगा शायद पर. तुम चुप्पी जितनी थोपोगे मेरे गीतों को क्या रोकोगे? For all those who do not understand Hindi, the translation. Who shall and who shan't understand? Who shall and who shan't understand? What language should I speak to thee? These words shall never comprehend my feelings in these poetry. My poems scream, but silently. Some matters stay as twisted tales. These words are you hear are words, not swords. When did I ever have that right to speak in language of your words? For each one here, wears laurel grand. Each word they speak is poetry. Who am I to utter such who labeled me as nobody? My poems scream, but silently. Seated at the power helm, you would growl and rule the realm, and weapons would your forces hold to hunt us, mute us, overwhelm, and I might die like many a more, and you shall mute my every dream. How will you? Tell me, let me know. But stop my poems, deafening scream. Thank you so much.
Salman, please take a minute. We are running out of time. Yeah, over to you. Unmute yourself, Salman. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I just unfortunately, yeah, my mobile just cut out. So I will keep it short. So the thing is that I appreciate everyone. Thank you for having me. Nalsar, the legal the department of the university, and also Ajay Kranti. And even my emphasis would be like, my message would be that Pakistan would not be looking to verbs. You know, the precedent that was set in India would not be taken as an example anytime soon into decriminalizing homosexuality. And in comparison, what I see that there could be a reactionary, reversed kind of take also when it comes to LGBT rights in Pakistan, and what our government's position is. But what I would look forward to, for example, in South Asia in a larger context, even in India, and I appreciate this initiative also, is that there's more collaboration, there's more amplifying of voices of activists, authors, journalists, queer, who do not have the luxury and the opportunity and the democratic space also of being openly queer, for example, on their given space, and also grassroots, not just NGOized activists, like helping out and working towards the grassroots minority and working class LGBT folks also. So we need to empower those, and that is what I look forward towards India. It's been a struggle even in the 2 years. What I see that cross-border collaboration is less, but this should be encouraged. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salman. And we're just left with Sister Ho Chi Minh Islam. Sister Ho Chi Minh Islam, would you also take the question? I could see just one question coming up on how to engage with the legislative process to take our rights ahead. Over to you, Sister Ho Chi Minh Islam.
Well, first, I just want to say that just think about, I'm afraid to open up my thoughts. So what's the situation is going here in Bangladesh? We are far behind in this movement in South Asia, a long way to go, lots of things to do. I'm thinking to make some alliances and make a network for the transgender peoples in Bangladesh. And I wanted to talk with the policymakers, and I want to sit with the state representative, and I would like to talk with them. These persons exist in our society, in our country, and what they are actually thinking. But the positive sign is that during this pandemic, I did some relief work for transgender and sex workers communities in Bangladesh. In that time, I had to go and talk with some law enforcement agency and the state policymaker. They are in that time so friendly to talk about transgender people's rights. But I think I'm planning to make a collaboration with the alliances and organizations who are working here in Bangladesh about these rights. And I want to talk about the policymakers on behalf of the government, what they are thinking. Will they do something, or will they accept us as a human being, as a citizen? Being a good citizen and doing the contribution for the society all the time, if the state or the policymaker or the government doesn't recognize me, so it's really very bad thing for a human being. So still we're like organizing, talking, and I think a solution will become soon, but we need to work hard. And I think such kind of discussion we need more and more. And that's it actually. Thank you so much for everyone.
Thank you ever so much, Sister Ho Chi Minh Islam, and I thank each one of our very brilliant panelists. Each of you brought such rich perspectives and insights and such courage that your lives are brimming with courage, and I'm deeply humbled to be able to moderate this panel. Thank you ever so much. And for that one question, I'll answer it myself. I would urge each one of us to engage with our respective MLAs, MPs, build pressure, leverage the Right to Information Act that we have in India. It could vary from country to country. Leverage the Right to Information Act, engage in public interest litigations, in grassroots activism, everything that we can cling on to. On that note, thank you ever so much again, and I'm deeply humbled. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much, ma'am. It's been a great and enriching experience being with you all today. I just want to add one point. This event is also a milestone for Nalsar as a university, from having an openly homophobic group called Abhorrently Anti-Gay to organizing this event of queer persons, for queer persons, and by queer persons and allies of PPG. It's been a great journey for Nalsar too. Again, thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.